Assalamu alaikum students. Today our topic of discussion is lymphatic system, and this is the topic from the third chapter of circulation from Guyton. First of all, a very basic concept about lymphatic system. It is an accessory route through which fluid can flow from the interstitial spaces into the blood. So it is an accessory route. The main route is from the interstitial spaces to back reabsorb into the veins. So firstly, the fluid from the blood filter into the interstitial spaces, and with the fluid, oxygen and nutrients go into the interstitial spaces and then into the tissues, and from tissues carbon dioxide and waste products come back into the interstitial space or interstitial fluid, and this interstitial fluid then reabsorbs back in the veins and then into the blood again. So this is the main path, and the accessory route is through lymphatics, that the interstitial fluid come back into the blood through lymphatics, and that is 10%. 90% of the interstitial fluid reabsorbed back through the veins. So most important, the lymphatics can carry proteins away from the tissue spaces, neither of which can be removed by absorption directly into the blood capillaries. So the lymphatics can mainly carry the proteins which come from the blood into the interstitial spaces. The return of proteins to the blood from the interstitial spaces is an essential function, without which we would die within about 24 hours. So this comeback of, or the return of proteins from the interstitial spaces back into the blood through lymphatics is very important, because these proteins in the blood maintain the oncotic pressure and retain the blood and retain the volume of the blood. So this is very important. Lymphatic channels of the body. Almost all the tissues of the body have special lymph channels that drain excess fluid, but exceptions include superficial portion of the skin, central nervous system, endomysium of the muscles, and the bones. So these are a few exceptions where lymph channels are not present, but these specific parts include pre-lymphatics, that are minute interstitial channels. These pre-lymphatics drain into the lymphatic vessels. These pre-lymphatic channels drain interstitial fluid from these tissues, for example, skin and central nervous system and endomysium of the muscle and bones, into the lymphatic vessels, or in case of brain into the CSF, and then directly back into the blood. So the lymph of brain firstly drain into the CSF and then into the blood. And this is your anatomy. That all the lymph vessels from a lower part of the body eventually empties into the thoracic duct, and which in turn empties into the blood venous system at the junction of left internal jugular and left subclavian vein. So the thoracic duct ultimately drains into the blood venous system at the level of junction between internal jugular vein, left internal jugular vein, and left subclavian vein in case of lower part of the body. And while lymph from left side of the head, left arm, and part of the chest region, same as above, firstly into thoracic duct and then into the junction between left internal jugular and left subclavian vein. And from right side of the neck, head, and right arm, and part of right thorax, enters the right lymphatic duct, firstly into right lymphatic duct, and then the right lymphatic duct opens at the level of blood venous system at the junction of right subclavian vein and internal jugular vein. So this is the drainage of lymph through lymphatic channel into the blood to the venous system. About 1 ton of fluid instead enters the lymphatic capillaries and returns to the blood through the lymphatic system. As I have already told you that 90% of the blood of the interstitial fluid reabsorbs back through the veins, and 10%, that is 1/10 of the fluid of the interstitial fluid, use the path of lymphatic capillaries. A total quantity of all this lymph is normally only 2 to 3 liters each day. So the whole quantity that is produced during a day is of lymph is 2 to 3 liters. The fluid that returns to the circulation by way of lymphatics is extremely important, because substances of high molecular weight such as proteins cannot be absorbed from the tissue. So this pathway is very important, because the proteins with high molecular weight cannot be reabsorbed back through veins, so they follow the path of lymphatics. The edge of one endothelial cell of the lymphatic capillary overlap the edge of adjacent cell in such a way that the overlapping edge is free to flap inward, thus forming a minute valve that opens to the interior of the lymphatic capillaries. So you can see here, this one as well, and you can see also here, this is one endothelial cell, this is another endothelial cell, and they are overlapping each other, and this is the valve, and this is the lumen of lymphatic capillary. So you can see here the valve. Okay. Fluid has difficulty in leaving the capillary once it has entered, because any backflow closes the valve flap. So these valves, as you know, the function of valve, it prevents the backflow. So it in this case it prevents the backflow of lymph. So valves along there are large vessels up to the point where they empty into the blood circulation. Formation of lymph. Lymph is derived from interstitial fluid that flows into the lymphatics. The protein concentration varies with the organ or the area of the body, but its average is 2 gram per deciliter. Liver 6 gram per deciliter, intestine 3 to 4 gram per deciliter, thoracic ducts 3 to 5 gram per deciliter. 2/3 of all lymph normally is derived from the liver and intestine. These are few facts regarding the lymph. After a fatty meal, thoracic duct lymph sometimes contain as much as 1 to 2% fat. Bacteria can push their way between the endothelial cells of the lymphatic capillaries, and in this way enter the lymph and killed when reach lymph nodes. So bacteria can be killed by the lymph when it reaches the lymph node. Rate of lymph flow. Total estimated lymph flow of about 120 ml per hour, or 2 to 3 liters per day, as you have studied in the previous slides. Effect of interstitial fluid pressure on lymph flow. So any factor that increases interstitial fluid pressure also increases lymph flow if the lymph vessels are functionally normal. So when the interstitial fluid pressure is increased, the lymph flow is increased, because it has a direct relation with the interstitial fluid, because the lymph comes from interstitial fluid. So these are a few factors which affect interstitial fluid pressure: elevated capillary pressure, decreased plasma colloid osmotic pressure, increased interstitial fluid colloid osmotic pressure, increased permeability of the capillaries. So you can see here, firstly we will discuss the elevated capillary pressure. When the capillary pressure is increased, there is more force of a fluid from inward to outward, so there is more leakage of fluid. So when there is more leakage from the capillaries, there is more formation of interstitial fluid. So when the interstitial fluid volume is increased, its pressure is increased, and that's why the formation of lymph is increased, because from the interstitial fluid, the fluid goes into the lymphatic capillaries. 10% of the fluid goes into the lymphatic capillaries. Decreased plasma colloid osmotic pressure. You have studied in the Starling forces, in the topic of Starling forces, that when the plasma colloid osmotic pressure is another name of plasma colloid oncotic pressure. Plasma oncotic pressure, that is due to proteins. So when it is decreased, there is a decreased number of proteins in the plasma, and the function of proteins is to retain the fluid in the blood vessel. So when this retaining power is lost, fluid cannot retain in the blood vessels. It leaks into the interstitial space. Thus the interstitial fluid pressure increases, and the formation of lymph is increased, and thus the pressure of lymph is also increased. And the other is increased interstitial fluid colloid osmotic pressure. So when the proteins in the interstitial fluid increase, so there is more retaining of fluid in the interstitial spaces. So the pressure or the volume of interstitial fluid is increased. That's why the lymph formation is increased. Increased permeability of the capillaries. When there is more leakage from the capillaries, there is more formation of interstitial fluid, and interstitial fluid pressure is increased, and this results in more formation of lymph and increase in the pressure and volume of lymph. Lymphatic pump increases lymph flow. When a collecting lymphatic or larger lymph vessels become stretched with the fluid, the smooth muscles in the walls of vessel automatically contract. So when there is more fluid inside the lymphatic capillaries, they as a reflex contract automatically, and each segment of the lymph vessel between successive valve functions as a separate automatic pump. So the part between two valves, part of lymph vessel between two valves is considered as a separate automatic pump, and this pump activates when there is more fluid inside the capillaries. It is operated automatically. When there is more fluid, the lymph automatic pump, that is between two valves, two successive valves, the part of lymph vessel between two successive valves stretched automatically and contract automatically. Firstly stretch and then contract. So this is also an example of delayed compliance. Even a slight filling of a segment causes it to contract, and the fluid is pumped through the next valve into the next. So firstly there is a increase in volume of fluid inside the segment, then the segment is stretched, and then it automatically contracts, and it pumps the fluid into the next segment by opening of valve. So this is the whole mechanism. The process continuing all along the lymph vessel until the fluid is finally emptied into the blood circulation. So ultimately the fluid enters the blood circulation by this process of lymphatic pump and opening of valves. Pumping caused by external intermittent compression of the lymphatics. The pump is also controlled by some external compression of the lymphatics, which can occur by contraction of surrounding skeletal muscles, which also put pressure on the lymphatics, movement of body parts, which also put pressure on the lymphatics, pulsation of arteries adjacent to the lymphatics, compression of tissue by objects outside the body. So these are the few factors which also regulate the contraction of lymphatic pump. The lymphatic pump becomes very active during exercise, often increasing lymph flow 10 to 30 folds. Conversely, during period of rest, lymph flow is sluggish, almost zero. So these are few facts. This is the main statement. The rate of lymph flow is determined by the product of interstitial fluid pressure times the activity of lymphatic pump. So you have studied there are 4 factors which affect the interstitial fluid pressure, and you have also studied how the activity of lymphatic pump is controlled. So these are the 2 factors on which the rate of lymph flow is dependent. The lymphatic system also plays a central role in controlling the concentration of proteins in the interstitial fluid, the volume of interstitial fluid, the interstitial fluid pressure. So these are the few factors which are controlled by lymphatic system. You can see here the endothelial cells overlap each other, having a valve. You can also see here the overlapping of endothelial cells and formation of valves. Interstitial space. In yellow there are lymph capillaries which are surrounding the capillary bed. There are also lymph capillaries in the pulmonary capillaries, with pulmonary capillaries, and here with on the lower side, on the lower there is with the systemic capillaries. On upper with pulmonary capillaries there is interaction of lymphatic capillaries with pulmonary capillaries, and on lower there is interaction of lymphatic capillaries with systemic capillary network. This is the whole lecture. If there is any query, you can ask me.